My name's Alexandra Lucas Urtola, and I'm the chairwoman of the Lucas Brothers Foundation. The board and I are just so pleased to be a sponsor for this year's summit, Economic Summit. I am so nervous, so I'm going to read every word because I can't do it. Anyway, a little information about the foundation. The Lucas Brothers Foundation originated in the early 1980s when my father, Don Lucas, and his brothers, John and Richard, came together with a shared purpose to support research in the fight against prostate cancer. The organization was originally established as the Richard M. Lucas Foundation for Prostatic Cancer Research, created during the final months of Richard's life. The foundation was formed to honor his memory and to help advance research. Uncle Richard was 52 years old. Over the years, the foundation grew financially and expanded its areas of interest to include higher education, education for the underprivileged, a research wind tunnel, medical imaging, business ethics, economics, Alzheimer's research, and other causes generated by John and Don Lucas. My father joined SIEPR. He joined the SIEPR Advisory Board in 1988. He served as chair of the advisory board from 2001 to 2007 and helped launch the first SIEPR Economic Summit in 2004. As John Chauvin so eloquently wrote, Don was a remarkable person, truly larger than life. I can most certainly attest to that as he continues to guide us today in support of SIEPR. In his spirit and in this spirit, I'm honored and pleased to introduce the distinguished speakers for our next panel, a conversation with Dr. Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi is one of the most influential economic policymakers of our era, an Italian economist, central banker, and public servant. He was president of the European Central Bank from 2011 to 2019, where he played a pivotal role in navigating the Eurozone through the sovereign debt crisis. He subsequently served as Prime Minister of Italy from 2021 to 2022. He also recently authored the influential Draghi Report on the future of Europe's competitiveness for the European Commission. We are honored to have him with us today. Moderating our discussion today is Jeanette Garretty, Chief Economist and Managing Director at Robertson Stephens Wealth Management. Jeanette is a member of the Executive Board of SIEPR and brings decades of expertise in economics and finance, having held senior roles at Wells Fargo Private Bank and Bank of America. She is also on the board of the Washington Institute for the Near East Policy and the executive board of Phi Beta Kappa, and most importantly, an alumni of Stanford.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much, and good afternoon. You're nervous? This is like interviewing Forrest Gump, you know? I mean, anything that has happened in the last 15 years, he's been there. I may have a very narrow focus on these things. Many of you know me as an economist, but I'm also a banker. And every time there's been a most interesting moment in life in the last 20 years, Dr. Draghi has been in the middle of it. So it is a great honor to have you here and to be able to conduct this discussion with you. Dr. Draghi is going to, I know he's asked me to call him Mario, so you'll see me go back to that, but this is a little bit difficult. He's going to make a few formal remarks, and then I get to ask questions, and then we will turn to some questions from the audience as well. You know, Mario, a common theme throughout your career has been that of economic resilience. We talked about it as we were preparing for this panel. Economic resilience depends on how successfully policymakers respond to crises, but it also depends on the quality of the institutions and the markets and how they underpin that resiliency. I'm hoping that in your opening remarks that you could speak to the resilience that you've observed in the global economy over the last 15 years and whether that apparent resilience is masking potential cracks that may surface in the road ahead. Quite frankly, you can talk about anything you want to. Let's be honest here. And there's so much to choose from. So, but I think that would be a lovely starting point.
Well, thank you, Jeanette. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for this warm welcome and also for the honor of having me here for the award. I mean, if you look, I'll try to start on a positive note, very positive. I mean, if we look back to the last 5 years, since COVID, well, I think it'd be hard to have it done better than we did. It's been a very intense time full of shocks. We had COVID, we had an energy crisis, we had war starting all over in Europe, mostly. And somehow our economies, especially the US economy more than Europe, but Europe too, had been remarkably resilient. I don't think I ever remember using the word resilience so many times as in the last 2 or 3 years. Our expectations were constantly shown to be wrong. And so it's a good question. How come? Well, I think the answer is a combination of policymakers doing by and large the right thing, the private sector showing an extraordinary adaptability, capacity to adapt, flexibility, which we didn't expect to have it. And as you said, overall, we had institutions that were quite strong. So let me start from the policy responses. I mean, we had policy backstops during COVID and after COVID, huge policy backstops that, again, were of an unprecedented size. That helped to smooth out COVID effects and then to engineer a recovery which lasted for a long time. We've been lucky, by the way, and I'll come back on that. Because then after that, what was a little too much was 3 extraordinary fiscal expansions. I mean, the amount of deficit, and I'll come back when you talk about cracks in the future, the amount of deficit was created was staggering. And basically after that, we had an energy crisis and then inflation starting. So point is that then you had to tight all of a sudden. Again, perhaps it could have been earlier. But there are different explanations between here and in Europe. In Europe, well, no, I don't want to be. Otherwise, it's going to get too long. But I mean, so we had an energy. So when we thought we're going to tight so fast, then this is going to cause some sort of recession, maybe slower growth. No, because energy prices at that point went down, so they supported real wages, personal consumption expenditure, and the economy stood up, basically. And then we have, on the private sector side, we didn't expect the private sector, companies, firms, to be so capable of diversifying quickly and without major disruption disruptions in the supply chains. So that is something that's rarely observed, but actually was a fundamental component, because we had observed disruptions in supply chains during COVID, so we did expect that could last. Didn't last, not at all. And then we had basically households' budgets which were solid. They had space. And we had, in all this, we had robust financial institutions, mostly, I would say, banks. But we also had growth in the financial sector, especially the non-banking sector, which helped to create monetary support for the recovery. So all this was quite remarkable, with the benefit of hindsight, and should be also of some comfort now that we look around and we see something less positive all around the world now. Now, coming to the things that, now Europe has been especially, I would say, should be less complacent about resilience, because we've been more lucky. I mean, we had a series of shocks and counter shocks that I mentioned that. So the question is, what's the likelihood that this is going to repeat again when we have another crisis or something like that? Well, here we come. First thing, deficits are very high. They're high, very high here, and they have been high in Europe, not as high as here, but basically most European countries don't have fiscal space. The one which has fiscal space is actually exhausting it quickly to spend on defense, to invest on defense, which is Germany. Incidentally, without that fiscal expansion in Germany, and without the front loading in our exports caused by the new tariffs here, Europe would be in a recession now. The forecasts at the end of December 22 for Europe were infinitely better than what happened next. And in 23, 25, those 3 years, we performed much less than forecasted. And so if we didn't have those coincidences, those sort of offsetting shocks, we would be in a recession now. So there isn't much to be complacent in Europe, and for as far as the future is concerned. And here we come to the major crack, the major doubt about the future is fiscal sustainability and inflation, potentially. Fiscal sustainability, well, because I mean, everything's been done in the last 3-4 years. Tell me something that was not potential inflationary. Everything, no? Yeah. Can you find something that was, perhaps deregulation was not? Deregulation was not inflationary. But other than that, everything points towards that direction. So that is one problem. The second problem is fiscal sustainability, because we don't have so far any sign that the government deficit is going to stabilize sometime in the medium term. And so how do why aren't the markets pricing this in the way, again, another expectation which has gone wrong now, because I would have expected markets had priced this a long time ago. No, they are not doing it. Why? Well, because next to this, we have AI, and we have this incredible technological revolution, and this is shown to increase productivity and therefore growth to an extent that was unimaginable until even 2 years ago. So, and clearly, if growth goes up, a deficit might become sustainable. The changes in productivity growth numbers that are needed to stabilize deficit path are not extravagant. They are in the realm of serious possibilities. So that is, now at the same time, we have to see what are the assumptions as far as future deficit projections too. So we have to see, well, to make sure that at some point this deficit comes under control, not necessarily now, but with a credible medium-term path. So that's what I see.
Not wishing to encourage, the dismal economist kind of thing that we've joked about much of the day, but thinking a little bit about those cracks against the backdrop of what you said about it is really remarkable where we are. I'm thinking, there's a phrase, it's better to be lucky than good. So, we'll take that. Yeah. You became famous in 2012. I think you even wrote a book, maybe only in Italian, but I think wrote a book about this that had this title for this phrase, whatever it takes. There are dissertations upon dissertations that are written out there on this phrase, whatever it takes. What people often forget is that there was the rest of that phrase, which as I understand it was that you said, and believe me, it will be enough. Now this was in the context of defending the euro, an existential threat to the euro. I'm curious about the confidence of, and believe me, it will be enough. Where does that confidence come from? Would it be harder? Is it going to be harder to have that confidence today if there's some crack that emerges that requires us to address it?
Well, as you may imagine, I was asked this question many times in the last 13 years. That was quite useful for me to put together and remember how exactly things went, which is the answer to the question, why such a line had such a success. Now, the first thing is context. That was probably arguably the lowest point for the European Central Bank. We had raised interest rates twice in 2011 in the midst of the worst recession we ever had since the Second World War. Then at the end of 2011, I start my tenure as president of the ECB, and we start lowering interest rates. Notice, nobody was actually asking for it in Germany.
Yeah.
So that came as a shock, first surprise. Then we took a series of unprecedented decisions on monetary policy, like extending long-term maturity, long-term credit lines for banks. Markets were not impressed. And the euro continued to spiraling down. And then in June, we had a momentous decision, actually, by all the leaders of Europe. They created the banking union with one banking supervisor. Markets have not reacted. Mm-hmm. So that's when it happens that I give this line. So that was the context. Then you have communication. Yes, those words had never been stated before in Europe in that way. And that was part of the success. But the other part was substance. What I say is not only, believe me, it's going to be enough or adequate, but also, and it's within my mandate. Actually, I was speaking about the ECB, so it's within its mandate. And that was important because it made it credible, because the first reaction was, oh, he's overstepping the mandate of the ECB, because the mandate is pretty narrow. It says we should look at price stability. So how come I didn't overstep this line in saying we are doing whatever it takes to? Well, the answer there is that the euro was about to disappear, to evaporate. And so if your currency evaporates, there is no more price stability to keep, basically. I think that was for now we look at that with certain distance, but at that time was something I really felt very much under pressure because of this. But the other thing was that all this didn't come as something that was an improvisation. there had been meetings before. There were papers, secret papers, of course, studying this. So that statement came in the way it came because of communication, but the substance of the statement had been vastly prepared before by the staff of the ECB. And then, of course, within a few days' time, the Governing Council confirmed that and issued a press statement where this monetary policy stance would be confirmed for the years to come. And the difference, and that's the last part, perhaps it's the most important part of or most important reason of success, was that the interventions that we would make would be unlimited. Because you see, there have been before programs of purchasing government bonds of different countries, but they were limited. And markets easily saw through them and basically destroyed the program. So that program was meant to be unlimited. And that's why, so I gave you a pretty sort of structured answer because I had 13 years to think about that.
To practice the answer.
And put things together, really.
I'm probably going to ask a follow-on question here for which you have had a lot of practice as well, so I apologize to you. But if I take you back to an earlier crisis, one that impacted you a little bit differently than it did us here in the United States, the global financial crisis. You were governor of the Bank of Italy, and then you were elected the first chair of the Financial Stability Board of central bankers, bank supervisors, and I think you were elected that by your peers, as I recall. You know, with friends like that, you don't need enemies. So, there are a lot of people that think that the problems we have today, socially, economically, whatever, trace back to some of the stepping beyond the mandate, the traditional behavior that occurred during the global financial crisis, specifically quantitative easing. And so I want to ask you about that from your perspective at the time, governor of Bank of Italy, but you also undertook quantitative easing at the ECB. Would there have been an alternative? Would you say, thinking about it, I wouldn't do that again, especially now as we're thinking about quantitative tightening, if you will, or at least no more QE? Or do you think that that is a tool that appropriately stays in people's toolbox?
No, I think you asked two questions, because in the case of Europe, QE came 2 years, well, several years actually, 4 years after the great financial crisis. But they are right in saying that many developments, social development, economic, political developments, go back to the great financial crisis and the responses that were given to it. By the way, incidentally, as chairman of the Financial Stability Board, I remember but this was early. It was 2007 when we start seeing the first cracks in the system with the first crisis, the subprime, and the G20 and the G7. The G20 of President Bush and the G7 with Secretary Paulson asked the Financial Stability Board and myself to prepare a report. And there are people here who remember that. And so we came out 4 or 5 months later, in April 2008, with a series of recommendations, many, 77, for all kinds of sectors of the financial sector, all kinds of businesses in the financial sector. And I should say most of them, if not all of them, have been adopted, were later adopted by Congress.
Yeah.
And in Europe, instead, the various people gold-plated upon them and added regulation upon regulation and basically killed part of the financial sector industries, like securitization, was killed in Europe, has been killed now, has been dead for something like more than 10 years. And it goes back to that decision without any reason to do so in Europe, by the way, because securitizations in Europe was actually performing pretty well. The default rates were close to zero. So it was an entirely different context. But basically, as far as Europe is concerned, the response that was given to the great financial crisis in terms of fiscal policy is probably one of the reasons why we are experiencing so much populism in Europe since then, both left side populists and right extreme. And the reason is that the fiscal policy that was adopted after 2010 has been totally wrong. Basically, what happens is that after 2010, we enter into a period called fiscal austerity. So all European countries started tightening all their budgets, and so on, and without interruption. To give you an idea, investments in Europe, private sector investments, go back to the level pre-Great Financial Crisis only in 2019. In this country, they were back to the level after 1 year and a half after the Great Financial Crisis. If you take the years after, depending on which year depending on the time span, you see that the U.S. economy, U.S. government injected in the economy here in this country about 7 times public money was injected in Europe, between 3 and 7 times. And that explains a lot of the differences in growth, productivity, and everything else. So this, I think it was mostly the fiscal response. In terms of monetary policy, I mentioned before the mistakes that we made in 2011, which compounded on a wrong fiscal policy. And so it was, the QE time comes after. And it comes after in, I think it was 2014 that I announced in August, actually here in Jackson Hole, I announced the undertaking of QE in Europe. Well, and people ask whether this had consequences or not. Well, given that fiscal policy was actually hampering growth all throughout, the monetary policy response accounts for the creation of something between 3 and 4 million jobs. And when I finished with my tenure at the ECB was November 19, so I take responsibility for everything that happened until then, not later. Not later. But there was a study there, a counterfactual study showing that if we didn't have QE, only QE, so I'm not speaking about, I'm not talking about interest rates, only QE, we would have had inflation rate lower by 1% and growth lower by 1% and unemployment higher by more than 1%. Yeah. So that's the post-mortem of QE. Then what happened after that, whether QE actually, the prolonging QE too long after that was a source of inflation in Europe, I mean, I don't know. Point is, and that's probably what I was about to say before, in Europe too, tightening came late.
Yeah.
But the reason why it came late in Europe is that everybody kept on saying that the increase in the price of energy was temporary. And the reason why it was thought that it was temporary is that in fact it was the outcome of it. I'm now speaking specifically of the natural gas prices. That was the outcome, the deliberate outcome of President Putin's strategy. starting in 2020, the strategy was to make sure that the Russian company delivering natural gas to Europe would deliver at the contractual minima, so that by the time he started the war in Ukraine, 2 years later, all European countries would have their stocks at the lowest possible level. And so prices started going up 2 years in advance, really, and nobody knew why. So that is I think the justification that I would give for a delayed monetary tightening in Europe.
Right. Life is difficult to predict sometimes, huh?
Very difficult.
Yeah, and now we have another natural gas situation going on, now also impacting Europe. I'll come back to that. I want to be sure we have some time to talk about more current events, specifically this remarkable, I've been calling it a paper. It's not a paper, it's a book. This is the future of European competitiveness. You can get it bound on Amazon, or you can download it and print it off. Be sure you have lots of paper in your printer if you do that. And there are, I already know a number of questions about that, and we're stepping towards where we are today in terms of Europe. Before we go there, as a way of segueing, I just want to ask you a personal question. You did your PhD at MIT under two absolute giants in economics, Franco Modigliani and Robert Solow. And then you taught for a few years, I believe primarily in Italy, but you pretty quickly moved into work with the Bank of Italy and the Italian Ministry of the Treasury and the World Bank. I'm curious, did you always know that your destiny was going to be in civil service and public policy?
Oh, no, absolutely no.
No?
No.
No?
No, I actually, it was not that quick, because I spent about a total of about 15 years being an academic. But let me say just one thing. That time at MIT was sort of a miracle, because we not only had Franco Modigliani and Bob Solow, but I also had the privilege of having Peter Diamond in theory, and I had Bob Engel in econometrics, and I had been TA of Paul Samuelson. So during that time, there were 5 Nobel Prizes teaching at MIT. And I can safely say that I think that I owe the greatest debt of gratitude to my teachers there, not only the Nobel Prize, but everybody there. And I think that much what happened to me later goes back to the period of time of my life that changed me forever. So I think that much of the credit should go to them, if not all of it, actually.
Maybe we'll give them credit for that confidence of whatever it takes, huh?
I don't know, maybe. Okay. But basically, no. Then after that, after those years as a professor, then I kind of was curious to see, to know more about policy, and so I made the first timid step into the World Bank. But still, when I was living in Washington, I would try to go to seminars at MIT every week, because I had not decided to leave my chair in Florence. But then after that, I was taken up so much by policy, by debt, by developing countries. That was the time of the debt crisis in Latin America. So at that time, then at the end, I became head of the Treasury in Italy. So I went back, and I probably had to go through, in the first 5 years, had to go through the most critical time in my country when Italy was really on the verge of defaulting. It was a country that was ranked AAA in its debt and lost, I think in 2 years' time, it was, I think it was around single B or something like that. So it was really, and at that time, you realize that, I mean, what you do actually matters. And you can make a difference. And that's when the sense of having a mission in public service and civil service started. So it was not since the beginning.
Okay.
No, everything was pretty random. I would.
I think we're lucky that you decided to take that random walk and end up there. A few minutes ago, you used the word timid step. I think that's probably the last time you're ever going to hear the word timid used in connection with Dr. Draghi. I'm sure they don't think of the word timid in Brussels, if that was really the key delivery point for this document on the future of European competitiveness. It is a very bold statement of what needs to be done, if I might, my opinion on this. And I think it's become even more relevant since September 2024, when you presented it, is that so many of the topics in there. By the way, it's extremely readable. It's extremely readable and very sobering. The issues that you raised in it are ones that are like in the news now all the time. You say quite clearly in the document that Europe must collectively refocus on the innovation gap with US and China, align decarbonization with competitiveness, I'll let that sink in, and increase security and independence, something that you call a genuine EU foreign policy. So how has your message been received? I guess that's the first question. And then do you have hope on the action steps that will come from that?
Yeah, well, first, let me say one thing about how this report came out, because it tells also why the substance was such sort of so up to date, so well received, and it also dispels the impression that I had written it myself, which would be an undeserved credit. The report has 3 legs. One is basically a statement of what's been done, and this was the Commission services actually were helpful in doing it. And they were actually the depository of the knowledge of what had been done. But then it's the second leg is really the industry. And I interviewed tens of CEOs for 10 sectors of the European economy, across all of them, from space to defense to pharma to green tech and so on, to energy, of course. And then the third leg was the incredible contributions by many academics, 2 Nobel Prizes, maybe 3, that simply had volunteered in getting interested in the issue. And they are, in a sense, also responsible for the narrative of the report, which is the part that is eminently readable. The book is about detailed prescriptions, sector by sector. And so it can get pretty technical. I mean, we had engineers, physicists, and economists, of course, also that worked on this report. So I've been blessed by all these contributions. Now, you asked me about how was it received. Oh, enthusiastically. Absolutely. It was, I'll tell you, About 3 months after the presentation, I was invited to a European Council meeting where all the leaders were sitting. And the president of the European Council, which at that time was taking place in Budapest, so it was Orban, President Orban, he said that he has decided to adopt this as a textbook in all the Hungarian schools. So just to, and everybody was enthusiastic, was embraced by the European Commission and so on. Now, that was encouraging. Oh no, one exception. There was a German finance minister that said, never, this report is never going to be acceptable. And the reason was that one figure that is quoted there, it's 800 billion euros of investment each and every year to finance. And he understood that it was 800 billion of public money, which is not said in the report. Actually, it's impossible. So what has to be is that most of it has to be private. So the question is, how is it that we mobilize this private flow of savings to finance such a need? And to do that, we have to do certain reforms. And so that's the policy part of the report. Incidentally, that figure now has gone up to 1.2 trillion in the meantime because of defense expenditure. And so that's how. Now, what's happened since then? Well, I should say not much. Not much. Well, there are good reasons for that, but the point is, the fact is that nothing, or no, not nothing, but very little has happened. However, I am pretty optimistic, in spite of the last year and a half, that things will change. This year will start changing. The reason why I'm so optimistic is that there has been an improvement in the self-awareness of the situation in Europe. When I started this report, when I started interviewing people, you see that there was immense complacency not only by governments, but also in the private sector, by the CEOs of most sectors. Then some of them I interviewed twice, 3 times, and as things were going on, they were becoming more and more aware of the depth of the abyss in which we were. Now that self-awareness, that sort of awareness is widespread, and if anything, people may get a little too desperate, but that's good, because it was really also an exercise in communication. One of the things that I've constantly tried to do also in my speeches was try to deflate the rhetoric of Europe being powerful. And it's true, we are 450 million, and it's one of the largest markets in the world, and we are very wealthy, unquestionably. But having said that, everything that is in place now points to go down, not up. Take any metric you may want to choose. And that's a sort of awareness I had been fighting for. Now that's there. And now people understand that, and especially the decision makers understand that their constituencies may actually be leaving them, not voting for them any longer if they don't do these things. This situation was not there 2 years ago. So to some extent, of course, external events like President Trump and others have also pushed in this direction, and that's why people. So there is going to be a European Council in the next, I think this coming week, and things are going to be presented. But it's going to be Europe is like a train that's been in the station. Now it's moving very slowly out of the station. The decisions taken in Germany as far as defense is concerned is one of the reasons why this train is moving. It will gain speed as we spend for investment, as we do the reforms. I think it will get full speed, however, only when these reforms are going to be made.
That's an optimistic note. That's excellent. There were
Cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously. Always qualify. Always, never, as an economist, never say never and always qualify. And I notice you didn't say a time, a date on the calendar when it's going to happen. There were a lot of questions about this report, and I think you addressed a lot of them. There was one question from the audience that I want to introduce maybe at this point. Somebody asked, what advice would you give young economists today in terms of where to focus on efforts for Europe's future? So specifically aiming at Europe and thinking about that. We have a few European economists here or economists in making here at SIEPR, so.
Well, I mean, there's plenty of things on which to focus. If one is, depends which economist we're talking about. I mean, if one is a theorist, it's very difficult to suggest what. But assuming that these economists you have in mind are potentially, I mean, they study economic policy, they do applied economics. In Europe, you have several areas, one of which, the first that comes to mind now, which in my view is the priority in terms of what actions to make, is energy. Is how do you build an industrial policy in Europe is a second. An industrial policy in Europe is a combination of energy policy, innovation policy, trade policy. So all the aspects are there. It goes from tariffs to taxes to subsidies, and especially the creation of agencies like, for example, DARPA here, that lead disruptive innovation.
Yeah.
Because you see, that's where the core of the problem is. When we started with this report, many friends, especially from this country, called me up and say, well, it's quite clear why Europe is doing so badly, because Europeans are lazy. That was serious.
They're not looking at your career, huh? I don't think so.
And they don't go to work, they're absentists, and so on. And also you have this incredible social welfare system that really destroys incentives. So I said, well, maybe it's true. Let's look. Now, what happens is that if you compare the productivity growth rates over, say, about 20 years in Europe and in the United States, productivity is higher in the United States, but then you ask why, and it's basically because of the high-tech sector. If you abstract from that, the rest has exactly the same productivity growth rates. So, first conclusion, maybe fact of having a big social welfare system is not the primary reason why Europe is doing so poorly. Second is what's driving the high-tech sector? It's innovation. And then the report started, basically. And so what can we do to improve on that? Of course, then you have problems like energy problems, you have other things, but the logic of the narrative starts from there. Then you ask, how do we mobilize, for example, private money to do that? To give you an example, research is the public money in percentage of GDP is about the same in US and in Europe. But the big difference is that in our case, it's 80% of total financing to research is public and 20% is private. In this country, it's just the other way around. 80% is private and 20% is public. So the next question for us was, how do you make sure that there's more private money going to finance research? And so on. But the logic is basically this one, the one I described.
I want to thank you for your time today. We're nearing the end of this. With some pride, I want to say that this is the first panel today, I think, that has not said the letters AI. I don't know what to make of that entirely, except that you did say innovation.
I did say it.
Did you say it earlier?
I did say it
okay.
once.
Once, okay.
Once.
I didn't hear it as a silver bullet solution. I think you were talking about other things and a broad perspective on what both where the world is today, an optimistic view of the future, and I think I hear great hope for what will happen in the European theater. So it's a long trip here, and I know that you don't get to stay and enjoy our weather for a very long time before you have to be on the move again. You're in quite demand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.